I don't know if you're a fan of French cinema, but there's a famous film that perfectly describes, among other things, just how complicated it can be to build a relationship of trust on the job. The film is called The Intouchable, and the story is drawn from an autobiographical book by Philippe Pozzo di Borgo, a French aristocrat and businessman who was paralyzed from the neck down after a hang-gliding accident. In his daily battle with his body, Philippe can count on an ally, his caregiver Abdel, whose name is Driss in the movie, an ex-con who turns his life upside down but with whom, in the end, he forms a solid bond based on friendship and, above all, trust. I say in the end because the beginning is not exactly terrific. Philippe's world of upper-middle-class do's and don'ts seems incompatible with Driss's exuberant, reckless style, making it hard for him to carry out even the simplest task, like holding the telephone for Philippe during a conversation, or putting a straw in his mouth so he can drink. But as the weeks go by, each one takes a step towards the other. Philippe understands that outside his elegant building, there is a world in which not everyone gets a fair shake. And Driss manages to see the person behind the brusque man disappointed by his life. By looking beyond their differences, by overcoming the obstacles that separate them, they find a common ground where they know they can rely on each other. This story is very apt because it talks about being afraid to face things, of having to put aside one's diffidence, and finally, trust, built one step at a time. Sure, I hear you say everything comes easier in the movies. Every effort leads to a happy ending. While it's true that building a genuine, trusting relationship in personal life or at work is no easy matter, it's always a worthwhile effort, because in the end, trust means giving someone a chance. But first and foremost, it means giving ourselves a chance. This is Getting to Know Us, a 4-part journey that looks past the surface and explores the values that guide us every day in our professional lives. Getting to Know Us is a podcast series by Cora Media, sponsored by Tessia Group. Is there someone you trust? Think about it for a few seconds. Probably many of you would pick a person you care for, a close friend, or your life partner. Maybe some of you would say, myself, but hardly anyone would name a colleague or someone with whom they don't have a close personal relationship. All of these answers are fine, of course, but there's an interesting aspect I'd like you to think about. Often we think of trust as more of a gut feeling or a question of the heart rather than the intellect. Does that mean that in order to create a positive climate of mutual trust at work, colleagues have to become close friends? Not at all, but we can work on ourselves, try to give the term trust a broader meaning. Nicola De Pisapia, associate professor in the Department of Psychology and Cognitive Science at the University of Trento in Italy, underscores the neuroscience point of view, according to which trust is a relational competence consisting of 2 components, a cognitive and an emotive one. The first, the cognitive component, has to do with our expectations regarding the other's abilities. We trust in his or her ability to perform a task. This is closely linked with the mechanisms influenced by dopamine, a neurotransmitter that plays an important role in risk management but has little to do with emotions. The emotive component is instead regulated by oxytocin, a substance produced in the hypothalamus and released in the body when we are establishing an emotional relationship with someone. In the United States, there are the so-called oxytocin parties during which oxytocin is sprayed into the air to make people feel in sync with each other and let the fun begin. Naturally, the emotive component alone is not sufficient to establish a true trusting relationship. You also need the cognitive component, the one that makes you believe in the other's abilities. We have introduced a very important topic: expectations. I trust someone if I think they will be able to satisfy emotionally and cognitively my expectations. Now, let's try to apply this line of reasoning to our work environment. What do my colleagues expect from me? According to a recent article in the Harvard Business School magazine, trust in the workplace is a sort of triangle that rests on 3 pillars, 3 drivers. The first is authenticity. I trust you if I think you're sincere. Being authentic means facing complexity with an open mind, without defending ourselves or hiding behind an expressionless mask. The second pillar is logic. Here is the cognitive component Nicola De Pisapia alluded to. I trust you if your reasoning is sound, plausible, or if you have some specific competence on a given topic. If I think you know what you're talking about. But being authoritative isn't the same as being authoritarian. Would you have more faith in someone who explains their decision-making process and how they came to their conclusion, or someone who says, "This is what we're going to do because that's what I've decided"? The third and last pillar has to do with a term we've already dealt with and that will crop up often during our journey: empathy. I trust you if I think you are well disposed towards me, if you listen to my opinions and take my comments into consideration. Naturally, this doesn't mean we must always agree. Just make an effort to also see things from the other person's point of view. Authenticity, logic, and empathy. 3 concepts that can make the difference, can help us to build solid alliances with others, in our personal lives as well as at work. The good news is that we can work on these things and learn to reinforce those aspects we are less confident about or less skilled at. The bad news is that sometimes we are incredibly good at tripping ourselves up. Blame it on our emotions that can hold us back and prevent us from building a genuinely trusting relationship with the people we work with. Imagine that everyone recognizes a particular quality in you, like, for example, being very good at presenting projects to clients. You have a lot of experience, you're great at speaking in public, you are authoritative. You know how to capture people's attention. It's your specialty. But a new specialist has just joined your team. She's young, competent, and enthusiastic. Without beating around the bush, she asks you if she can make the presentation to the client. She has worked on it along with the entire team. She's familiar with the technical aspects. There is no reason not to trust her. Despite this, you have your doubts. She's new, and she wants to go to the front of the line without waiting her turn. Why does she want to do something we've always handled? Does she think she's better than we are? And so on. What is happening in our minds when we think these thoughts? Nicola De Pisapia points out that conflict, which is kind of the opposite of trust, also consists of a cognitive and an emotive component. The cognitive component involves a disagreement, an expectation that is not met. The emotive component is instead the part that makes us angry and fearful and leads to conflict with the other person. The conflict can be limited to facial expressions, or it might become verbal as well. If we examine our ancestral biological mechanisms, the emotive component activates the amygdala, a very powerful part of the brain that intervenes in 2 ways. On one hand, it sparks off a stress reaction in the body, speeding up the heart rate and breathing. On the other, it suppresses the prefrontal cortex, the general manager of the brain, the orchestra conductor. At work, if the prefrontal cortex isn't active, it can be a big problem because we cannot count on our more highly developed functions, like our intelligence. Speaking of conflict, a while back there was an image of a little notebook online. The cover read, "Hypothetical arguments I've won in the shower." A kind of invitation to write down all those conversations that didn't go the way we thought they'd go in real life. So we go over them again when we're more relaxed, maybe while we're taking a shower, because that's when you think of all those brilliant, winning things that you could have said but didn't come to mind at the time. With the benefit of hindsight, we can be very convincing speakers. But when we feel threatened, put on the spot, our instincts elicit an emotional response, which can be counterproductive, especially on the job. So, is it possible to train the mind to respond differently and spark off constructive discussion instead? To Nicola De Pisapia, it's a question of communication styles, which are not permanently fixed by innate components, but can be altered, so we can develop them. For example, an impulsive style leaves more room for the emotive component, while a rational and controlled style is more in line with the cognitive component. In a work environment, a rational style is clearly more useful and functional, and it can be augmented if the prefrontal cortex plays a more important role in our communication. There are some concrete, practical strategies that can be applied to help the prefrontal cortex manage the reaction of the amygdala. For example, taking a brief pause and letting the negative emotions we are feeling run their course before resuming our interaction with the other person. More or less the classic count to 10 strategy. There are other little tricks that, over time, can alter an entire communication style. Of course, these ideas are not that easy to put into practice, particularly in situations where there isn't time to reflect and we have to act quickly. Luckily, it's not all up to one person, and building relationships based on trust can help in this. When you realize you aren't up to it, you can count on the talent, skill, and sensibility of others. Imagine that you and your team have to solve an important technical problem. The situation is rather tense. The client expects an effective, low-cost solution. Your boss wants it quick. The department expects you to stay with it. Everyone wants something from you. In that situation, knowing that others have faith in you isn't as helpful as trusting the people around you. In a situation like the one I just described, exchanging opinions with the rest of the team could lead to a solution you all agree on, maybe resulting from an idea or a special skill contributed by a colleague that would normally not have been included. So, we see how inclusion plays a central role in building trust. And this brings us back to one of the issues we talked about at the start of this episode. The need to overcome the obstacles that prevent us from forming genuine relationships with other people, from seeing them as who they really are. This dialogue certainly calls for empathy, but it needs something else as well, because if we limit ourselves to reflecting other people's emotions, the differences would be reduced, leaving no space for inclusion. That's why, according to Nicola De Pisapia, it's important to start from a base of empathy, on which to build a relationship that values diversity, also from a more cognitive and less emotional standpoint. Understanding other people's abilities allows you to assign them to aspects of the work process where they can express themselves best and thrive in their diversity. All in all, giving someone else a chance is like giving yourself a chance. And there's an Ernest Hemingway quote that I find particularly fitting here. The best way to find out if you can trust somebody is to trust them. Getting to Know Us is a podcast series by Cora Media, sponsored by Tessia Group. Written by Alessandra Menozzi. Translated and narrated by Rosita Martini. Recording engineer, Luca Possi. Post-production and sound design by Cristiano Lomele. Production by Monia Donati. Text editing by Graziano Nani.